Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for Survivor 49 following episode 7, aka the merge episode, and I found this to be a pretty good episode, probably the best episode of the season so far, in the sense that we at least got a somewhat normal merge and not this whole earn the merge shtick that we've gotten used to in the new era. And I feel like beyond that, we got a pretty interesting vote off as well, and some interesting setup here to where I did find this to be a pretty interesting episode, and obviously with that comes an interesting power ranking. But with that out of the way, we have 11 people to talk about, and let's waste more time. Let's go into the video. So starting off at number 11, we have the latest boot from the season, and here we have Nate, who does end up being the merge boot of the season. And Nate was not my initial pick to be the merge boot here. I feel like it would have been more likely to be Jawan or Sage before this week. Though I think once we got into the episode and saw how the merge try broke down, it just made sense that Nate would go out, considering it didn't seem like the Ulis would have the numbers there, considering that Jawan and Sage were not gonna like blow up their games and they were pretty committed to flipping to the Hinas there. And I feel like the numbers just weren't there for Nate to actually stay by the end of it, to where unless there was like this truly crazy plurality vote, I feel like it didn't make sense logistically for Nate to stay here or Steven. So I feel like in that sense, I wasn't too surprised that Nate went out here. And if we're talking about Nate more generally, he's someone who I felt pretty good about coming to the season. He's someone who I feel like definitely had some skill for the game, someone who knew the game pretty well. And I feel like for the first couple episodes, he was definitely looking pretty appetizing of a contender, with him getting a good enough edit while also seeming to be in a good spot on the original Uli tribe, and through that he was relatively high in my power ranking for the first few episodes. Now granted, he was starting to fall off a little bit afterwards, where he definitely got less content as the season went along. I also felt like he was being propped up as a threat, with there being talk about him being the leader of Uli, this person that people need to target, without him really getting a chance to really defend himself per se, or to explain his gameplay style, where he even says in his exit interview that he didn't even see himself as a leader of Uli, but people saw him as that regardless. So again, I was worried for him in that regard. Though with that said, I still wasn't expecting him to be the merge boot specifically. I figured he would more so go out like a bit later on into the merge. But regardless, I still feel like Nate played a fine enough game. He's probably the best merge boot of the new era, which probably isn't saying much considering that a lot of the merge boots in the new era have been pretty bad. But I still think Nate's game was pretty good for his placement, with him having a lot of control in the original Uli and his first swap tribe. And while he did get a bad second swap and he didn't manage Jawan Sage the best at the merge, I still feel like his game was good enough for the most part, but he's now out of the game to where he's here at number 11. And before we continue, I am once again partnering up with Russell Muscle TV to promote Idle Plays. Idle Plays is an online shop where you can purchase Survivor puzzles and practice them so that you can be the next challenge beast on Survivor. And with Survivor 50 just around the corner, you can purchase relics from Survivor history with my Creator Camp package, which includes the Labyrinth puzzle, the Slide puzzle, and Spencer's 5-piece puzzle from Survivor Cambodia. If all that sounds exciting to you, feel free to click the link in my description and start shopping now. And with that, we have 10 people left in the game to talk about. As usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position. But at number 10, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on is still Sophie S. Or Sophie, I guess. And I feel like this episode was more the same for Sophie here. Now, she does get a visibility spike in the sense that we do see her talking about needing to stay Hina strong and how she knows she's a target there and how she needs to work with Sage, get information, which is expected considering that she was the initial target coming to this round. And she does eventually win immunity to get around that, but at the same time, I feel like it was pretty obvious she was winning immunity because she was talking about early on how she's a threat. So obviously that was pretty first shown. Now beyond that, she doesn't get that much to do, and I still feel like I have the same issue with her as I had with before, where we just don't know anything about her. We don't know anything about her like personality. We don't know anything about her true relationships in the game, to where while she does talk about like needing to work with Sage, that's more so circumstantial because Sage flips and because Sage is the one telling her that she's being targeted. So obviously I don't feel like that really adds too much of Sophie's edit. In general, I still feel like Sophie is pretty unlikely to win from this point on as well, to where she's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we're actually making a little bit of a shift here compared to last week, as I feel this person has kind of dropped off in my view, but at number 9 we do have MC. And this ends up being a bit of a weird episode for MC here, where she gets a lot of focus around her finding her idol, like considering that she hadn't found it already because she hadn't been the tribal, and obviously she gets a lot of focus around that, but at the same time, that doesn't really add much to her edit because it's situational. Like, it's there because she has to get that content. She ends up getting the idol there. They're always going to show that whether or not she's actually the winner or not. And yes, while it was kind of entertaining seeing her like trying to find the idol while Savannah was watching her and her like giving her thoughts on that. Again, I feel like that doesn't really add too much to the actual like trajectory of her game, and more so just trying to make the scene a bit more interesting, and also the fact that it just happened while she was looking for the idol. But beyond that, like, she gets all this talk about wanting to find the idol and like wanting to be safe, only for her to immediately play the idol at the first tribal. So I feel like the fact that we already got that payoff is probably not the greatest sign for her trajectory moving forward as well. And sort of similar to a lot of the other Hinas, we just don't really know that much about her. But while she's getting a lot of content, I feel like a lot of it doesn't really have much depth to it, to where I feel like we're not really getting to see MC outside these moments where she's necessary for the story, which comes up quite frequently because she is going on journeys and she is like involved in like find the Beware advantage. So really, I feel like this episode didn't really move the needle for me. And if anything, the fact that she already plays the idol immediately means that she probably doesn't have too much relevance to the story moving forward. So I feel like for those reasons, I'm not feeling too great about her, which is why she's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and this person didn't really go up that much, but more so MC went down. But at number 8, we do have Christina. And Christina's episode was just kind of whatever, if I'm being honest. Outside of one moment that happens at the immunity challenge, where Jeff decides to tell the cast that, hey, we're casting for Survivor 50 and we got some spots open, which obviously gets everyone excited. But then they decide to give Christina a confessional talking about how this opportunity means a lot and how this is where you need to step up your game. And again, I'm not going to spoil who actually gets on to 50 from this cast. However, I still find it somewhat interesting that they decide to give Christina, of all people, a confessional talking about the opportunity to be on 50 here, which, could imply that she could become a bigger player down the road here. And considering as well that we have seen that winners have generally gotten bigger edits as the season moves from the pre-merge to the post-merge, maybe this could be a turning point for Christina. No, truth be honest, I don't think so. I feel like her edit in the pre-merge was still very lackluster. And while she's in the majority at this point, I'm still very skeptical over whether Christina is actually going to step up her game or not to really rise to this like all-star level. But still, the fact that she got the confessional is at least something. I'll at least give her that. And I feel like that was enough to at least have her one spot higher, though at the end of the day, I'm still very much skeptical about her actual winning chances, which is why she's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and this is another person who I feel like has really gone down more recently, and I feel like this episode was not a great look for them, but at number 7 we do have Alex. And again, Alex is in the majority, I'll give him that. He does end up voting with Hina here to take out Nate here. That is something. However, I also don't think it really propped them up for that decision to work with Hina. And if anything, I feel like Sophie ended up dunking on him by saying that Alex would be dumb to stick with Hina when it seemed like that they were going to be working together. And the fact that we get Sophie's perspective on Alex breaking away here is not a great look for Alex here. And I think beyond that, like, well, he does get some confessionals here talking about how he's used to playing both sides and how Sophie has no clue that he's doing that. We do know that Sophie knows this, where Sophie does know that Alex is closer to Hina. And we even see the other Ulis talking about how they know that Alex isn't really on their side, to where I don't feel like Alex comes off in the greatest light there either. And I feel like Sophie has just really surpassed Alex as well in terms of her like being like this true like wild card in the season, like this one Kelly that is kind of like trying to infiltrate things, to where while Alex is technically in the majority right now over Sophie, I still don't feel like it's going to lead to Alex doing well moving forward. But I think, again, the big knock there is the fact that Sophie called Alex dumb for making this decision, and him going through with that is such a bad look to me that I did decide to bump him down here to number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and this person has gone up more so because Alex went down, but I feel like this episode wasn't the worst for them. But at number 6, we do have Jawan. And again, this was a fine episode for Jawan here in the sense that we do see him being joined into this new alliance, that being the bottom up alliance, and that alliance ultimately winning the day, where we do get a lot of focus on Jawan and Sage, like trying to trick the Ulis into thinking that like Shannon like went insane and that's why Shannon went out. But in reality, like, Jawan and Sage have flipped to the Hinas, and obviously they do get away with it by the end of it, where Jawan and Sage are successful in flipping over to the Hina side and saving Steven in the process. And even beyond that, like, Jawan gets to build upon his storyline from earlier, talking about how like Survivor's like a movie where they're entering Act 2, and this is the point where you're destroying the status quo, and sort of fulfilling like what he said earlier about how like at first you're running from the monster, but now you're becoming the monster. And again, I feel like this episode did sort of present Jawan as becoming the monster by him like devouring the Ulis, I guess. Now, beyond that, I still think there is plenty of worries there, like where Savannah is talking pretty negatively about him still, like to where I'm still inclined to think Savannah will get her way over him. And obviously, there's still the risk that now that the vote has happened, that the Ulis will catch on to what Juwan and Sage are doing. So again, take all that for what you will, but I still feel like this was an okay enough episode for Juwan here, mixing in the fact that I feel like other people like Alex went down to where I did feel at least a little bit comfortable having Juwan a little bit higher here to where I did decide to bump him up here to number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have a pretty similar person to get into here, and here we have Sage. And Sage is someone who I was a little concerned about after last week, where even though she had gotten decent content on her swap tribes, I was worried that now that Shannon is gone, that her purpose in the story would drop off. However, I feel like this episode did a good enough job at pivoting to where we now see that Sage's role is to be like this double agent where her and Jawan are pretending to work with the Ulis when in reality they're working with the Hinas, and she ends up building this bottom up alliance. And we do see her like being somewhat successful in tricking the other Ulis into thinking that the reason Shannon went out was because Shannon blew up her game. And beyond that, we see her like building good bonds with the Hinas. You have Sophie talking about how like she needs Sage to give her information about her being the target. And she is successful in pulling off this Nate blindside here, which is all pretty good there. So again, I do feel like this was a fine enough rebound for Sage here. I'm definitely feeling a little bit better for her now that she's gone past like this post-Shannon world. Now, obviously, there's still the risk that her game could still blow up from this point where the other Ulis are able to counter what Sage and Jawan are doing. And honestly, considering how like they're being presented in the story, I still think that a lot of those Ulis will bounce back. However, I still think considering that Sage was at least able to get past like this initial hump for me, mixing in the fact that she got less negativity early on the season compared to Jawan, where obviously Savannah is very actively targeting Jawan. That's the reason why I did decide to go with Sage one spot above Jawan for me, to where she's here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and this is someone who actually has gone down a little bit after this episode, but at number 4 we do have Rizzo. And this was a pretty weird episode for Rizzo, if I'm being honest here. And really it's kind of a weird episode for a lot of the top contenders on the Uli tribe here, in the sense that they obviously don't get their way here, where Rizzo, Savannah, and Sophie B are all blindsided by this vote, where Nate ends up going out there, which is obviously not great by itself. But I think for Rizzo in particular, it's probably a bit more of a negative here, where for one, we did have the setup relationship with Rizzo and Nate from earlier on. Rizzo was seen being closer to Nate than he was to the other top contenders. And I think by losing Nate there, that's obviously not great in itself, and probably a bigger negative for Rizzo than it is for them. But I think beyond that as well, like Rizzo also gets this confessional early on talking about how like everyone's here to socialize, but he's here to play the game, and that he's now going straight to business, which culminates in him getting outplayed, which is obviously a pretty bad look there. So I do feel like for Rizzo in particular, this was probably a worse episode for him than it was for the other Ulis here, in the sense that he does get undermined, both in the sense of him losing Nate, someone he did have a setup relationship with from earlier on, but also in the sense that he talks about how this is the point where he wants to step it up, only for him to obviously get outplayed by Jawan and Sage here, not really seeing that as a possibility there. And then you obviously have the game reality where his group is now on the out. And there's also the fact that he was talked about as a target for a lot of this round, only to be spared due to him very publicly having an idol there. And obviously, while he still has the idol because he didn't play it, I still think there are some in-game concerns as well for Rizzo. But I think edit-wise, like, there are definitely some pretty massive issues here with his merge episode here. And while I think there's definitely room for him to recover from this point, I feel like this is definitely the point of the season where you need to be stepping it up. And the fact that Rizzo is not is a reason why I did decide to bump him down here to number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have the highest ranked member of Hina at this point, and here we have Steven. And obviously Steven does end up surviving this tribal here in a spot to where he was the minority target, where he was being targeted by the Ulis here, only for him to survive here. And also in the process picking up Jawan and Sage, the bottom up alliance, to where it does seem like Steven is playing alright at this point. Like his group has the numbers, he seems to be well positioned within that group. And obviously like he is the most developed person of Hina, to where I feel like he has the best shot there. Now, honestly, I still feel very skeptical about his actual chances here, to where I still feel way more confident in the top 2 people to actually go on to win this season from this point on. However, I feel like Steven does benefit from other people going down, if I'm being honest. The likes of Alex going down, the likes of Rizzo going down, even Jawan and Sage. While I feel like this was probably a better episode for them than it was for Rizzo, I feel like there were still enough negatives from their earlier edits to where I couldn't justify them being like right next to Steven on this power ranking. But I still feel like Steven is definitely looking better than what he was before. Though with that said, I am still expecting Hina to lose the war by the end of it, where even though Hina does get the numbers there and wins the initial battle against Uli, I still feel like the fact that Hina in general is just very underdeveloped, and doesn't really have many solid contenders, makes me very concerned that the tide will turn at some point and that Hina will ultimately crack and be decimated. And obviously through that, Steven will eventually be taken out. So obviously that's still a massive concern for me. But I feel like for now, at least, considering that they did win this initial battle, considering that these other people have had pretty rocky episodes, I feel like it was enough to have Steven at least a couple spots higher for me, to where he's here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and it is the same top 2 as last week, which is kind of weird to say considering that this wasn't a great episode for either of these two people, considering that they were both on the outs on this latest vote. And even then, there's some weird editing stuff happening with both of them. However, I still feel like both of them are still the top contenders for me to actually win the season from this point on, and it is a matter of ordering them. However, at number 2, I did decide to make a change here compared to last week. So at number 2, we do have Savannah. And I think the reason I went with Savannah lower here is I feel like Savannah got a bit more negativity in this episode, where I think for one, we saw her more actively buying into the lie that Juwan and Sage are spreading about what happened with the Shannon vote, where she does seem to believe that story, which obviously leads into her approaching this vote from the wrong angle. But beyond that, you have the entire MC situation where she does end up catching MC idol hunting, and you have her trying to talk game to MC while she's idol hunting, only for MC to respond to that, saying how she sees through Savannah, talking about how she's this big player. And obviously those things are not great to see from Savannah, especially when she does later be on the outs for this vote. So obviously that's a big concern. Then also Juwan is being shown to be better insulated than what he was before, to where it'll be harder for Savannah to get Juwan out now. So again, I feel like there are some worry signs for Savannah after this episode. And there was definitely a debate for her being lower, though if I'm being honest, I feel like the people below her just have way more negatives at this point in the season. And yes, while you could argue that the likes of Juwan or Sage could be on the rise now that they have flipped over to Hina and got one over on the original Uli, I'm still willing to hold out for these top 2 for at least another week to see how they end up responding to this setback, whether they're able to make some progress, how they're portrayed as these underdog figures. So I feel like until we see evidence to the contrary, I'm still willing to lean on what we've seen from them before in the pre-merge, to where I did decide to keep them here at number 2. And now at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Survivor 49 at this point is Sophie B, or Soph, I guess is what we're calling her now. But in any event, I still feel like Sophie B is kind of in a weird spot as well here, where she is shown being on the outs here. You have her talking to Alex about potentially working together, only for Alex to defect to work with Hina instead. Though with that said, I still feel like we got more of Sophie's perspective when it came to what the original Kellys were doing, where Sophie got to say that Alex would be dumb for flipping to Hina, which Alex ends up doing, which I think probably is undermining Alex more than anything else. I also think Sophie was shown being a bit more aware about what the true tri dynamics were, where she recognized that Alex was likely going to flip to Hina. She also was not shown buying into the lie that Juwan and Sage are spreading. And similar to Christina, she also gets a confession talking about Survivor 50, where she talks about how she wants to go for a big competitor and make big moves, which can be seen as a pro and a con, in the sense that it's a pro in the sense that she's thinking about wanting to become a bigger player, but also con in the sense that she doesn't get her way there. So obviously make all that for what you will. Again, not talking about whether she actually gets on 50 or not. Now, I think you can also argue that her not using her knowledge is power is a negative, where she does talk about that several times in the episode. And despite her knowing that MC is the one with the idol, and Savannah also telling her about the idol, she doesn't end up using it there. And again, not saying she should have used it. It doesn't seem like it would have made a difference, but I still think it is an unresolved storyline there, and I still think it'll probably be significant, how Sophie ends up using it in the future. But I do think, compared to Savannah, I do feel like Sophie's merge episode was not as bad as Savannah's was, where I feel like she has fewer negatives in that regard. And I feel like that's the reason why I did decide to go with her one spot higher, where even though she still doesn't get her way in this actual round, I'm still confident that the Ulis will probably get to respond to this, that they'll probably be able to get a one up on the Hinas, especially considering that they have been way more developed as characters than most people on Hina there. So I feel like for that reason, I'm still willing to give both Savannah and Sophie the benefit of the doubt, but I feel like with Sophie having a less flawed merge episode, I did decide to give her one spot higher, so because of that, Sophie is here on number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week once the season has started, where we'll be getting into these players and seeing just how wrong I am about all these people, so be on the lookout for that. And I'm also going to be covering a whole bunch of shows coming up, including The Amazing Race and Hell's Kitchen, so be on the lookout for that as well. I'm on Patreon and have YouTube memberships, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.